For 10 years, between 1950 and 1960, Britain was at the cutting edge of missile and space technology. The country had its own ballistic missile called Blue Streak, which later became a world-class space rocket. Britain had its own rocket test site in the boggy wastelands of Cumbria. Armed with superweapons and backed by world-beating technology, the country believed it could be a superpower to rival America and Russia. This is the story of Blue Streak and how Britain's mighty missile, by a curious twist, ended up rocketing Europe into space. After the Second World War, Britain was battered but victorious. The country dreamt of an exciting future. It would be a third superpower alongside America and Russia. New and devastating technologies would hold the key. Armed with nuclear weapons and the missiles that would speed them to their target, the country would sit at the top table.
Britain is a country that thought of itself as a great power and thought of itself as a huge technological power, so it expected whenever the next technology came along, like rocketry, Britain would naturally participate.
The Nazis had been the first to develop deadly rockets. These were called V2s. During the war, the Germans had fired 1,000 of them at Britain in a desperate bid for victory. Hitler's vengeance weapons had not saved his regime, but they had changed the face of warfare forever. V2s had unleashed the age of the missile.
They left northern Germany, they looped neatly out of the atmosphere, and then they fell onto the Thames estuary and to other points around the south of England. Had they been loaded with the nuclear warheads, which made it a sensible system later on, they would have fried London from Kensington to Bermondsey. As it was, they only demolished London sort of a street at a time.
The V2 was a startling new piece of military hardware. It was over 40 feet long and flew 3 times faster than the speed of sound. As Nazi Germany collapsed, the Allies swooped.
East of the River Weser, the British Second Army discovered wrecked trains loaded with the remains of rockets and flying bombs. Here and there, they discovered V weapons intact. Woods and forests were the usual...
The Americans and Soviets plundered most of the V2 technology. The British experimented with what remained.
Britain fired 3 V2s at the end of the war, basically to gain experience, or as one German scientist put it, to discover what it was like to be at the other end of the trajectory.
By the start of the Cold War, missiles had become the key military weapon. They were lightning quick and almost impossible to shoot down. Russia had learnt a lot from the Nazis and was developing a new generation of nuclear-tipped missiles. Britain was in the firing line. The country desperately needed its own rocket to counter the Soviet threat. Britain's answer was Blue Streak. It would travel at 17 times the speed of sound and carry a nuclear warhead with the equivalent of 1 million tons of TNT. The country lagged behind the Americans and Soviets in rocket technology. It was hoped Blue Streak would put Britain back on level terms.
I think we were all excited by the new project. I think we all believed that the task we'd been given, the ballistic missile, made a lot of sense. But certainly back in 54, 55, where it did look like a ballistic missile was invulnerable. That once you could get it launched, there was no way the Soviets could defend themselves against it.
It was an enormous step forward, and it was an enormous task, but it wasn't beyond the industrial and technological capacity of this country.
The Cold War missile race was on. For the two firms building Bluestreak, the clock was ticking. The aircraft manufacturer de Havilland would make the Bluestreak body. The engine maker Rolls-Royce would build the rocket motor. To save time, Britain looked across the Atlantic. The US was way ahead with missile development. Faced with the Soviet threat, the Americans agreed to share basic rocket technology with the British.
If we wanted to build the thing within a reasonable timescale, we simply had to buy in that design expertise. It didn't cost us that much. It saved us perhaps 3 or 4 years development time. And time was of the essence here.
While de Havilland began building the Bluestreak body, Rolls-Royce re-engineered the motor. They were working to plans for an American engine called the S3, which was an upgraded Nazi V2 rocket motor. Rolls-Royce aimed to improve the US design.
No, in fact, Rolls-Royce did take the very first engine or so and make it to American drawings just to see how it worked. And it ran. But they very, very quickly realised that it was heavy, they could improve the performance, they could make it more reliable, all sorts of things, and started to give it the typical Rolls-Royce treatment.
The motor and the missile body were now under development, but other difficulties had to be overcome. Britain needed an isolated site in which to test the rocket. In the wilds of Cumbria, the missile men found their Shangri-La, a boggy wasteland called Spade Adam.
It's situated about 1,000 feet above sea level. Now this means that all of the weather that came up the Solway came straight up along the hills and of course getting colder and colder as it rose towards Spade Adam. And we got very, very cold weather up there.
In 1957, thousands of Irish navvies descended on Cumbria to begin work on the multi-million-pound site. The first job was to construct roads that could carry heavy loads across the bleak and inhospitable bogland.
Well, ironically, there's a place called Moscow Farm, which you have to pass on the way to Spade Adam. And the road stopped at Moscow Farm. So from Moscow Farm, we had to build our own roads, literally. And they adopted the techniques that were used by the Romans, and the whole lot floated on the bog. So the roads were literally floating.
Cumbria would soon boast one of the most advanced rocket test sites in the world. An army of workers braved the brutal weather to bring the space age to Spade Adam.
They were grafters. They worked in dreadful conditions. I mean, you're talking about 3 feet of snow. You're talking about frost that came so quickly that occasionally the lads were called off site because of the severity of the snow and the frost.
By 1958, the builders were moving out and the engineers were moving in. But there was a problem. The rocket base had been built in one of the most remote areas of the country. Even so, it was far too dangerous in crowded Britain to actually test launch a missile. At Spade Adam, the Bluestreak engines would be fired, but it would never leave the ground. Britain's missile men needed a launch pad for their rocket. The solution was found on the other side of the world, at Woomera in South Australia. In the middle of the outback, Britain began creating its own Cape Canaveral. There was a purpose-built launch pad for Bluestreak, and even a model rocket town.
Today, it's a busy little town in the middle of nowhere, with a population of well over 5,000, including 1,600 children, and a well-equipped hospital.
It was quite a compact little town. Families were there, schools, shops, supermarket. It had its own cinema, own gymnasium, plenty of sport. And you could, at weekends, get the loan of a company buggy and off you'd go and chase around the countryside and up to the opal mines, perhaps, if you're that way inclined. It was good.
Britain was conjuring up a space town from the sands of the desert. At Woomera, the Blue Streak superweapon would be fired and flown into space. Back in the UK, the engineers felt confident. Rolls-Royce was improving the rocket engine. De Havilland was crafting the complex body. By the late 1950s, Britain's first ballistic missile seemed destined for success. The hope was Blue Streak would rocket Britain to the top table of great power nations. By the late 1950s, Britain's superweapons program was underway. The country's nuclear missile was called Blue Streak. If war broke out, the 90-ton rocket would fly to Russia and wipe out its cities. Britain lagged behind in the missile race, but it was hoped Blue Streak would close the gap.
We all regarded it as something that mattered to Britain. I think we felt that we were part of a national project that was important and might even have very significant outcome in the end.
But there were complex problems to be solved before Blue Streak could fly. After blastoff, the rocket would roar into space. It would travel much further and faster than a wartime V2. In order to hit its target, Blue Streak would have to re-enter the atmosphere. No one knew if Britain's multi-million-pound missile would burn up like a comet, or what signals it might give out to enemy radar, enabling the Russians to shoot it down. The solution lay in a second rocket, which would answer these vital questions. It would be built and tested in Britain and flown at the country's space base in Australia. It was called Black Knight.
If you're going to launch a warhead 2,000 miles, then it's going to be going at very high speed. It's going to go out of the atmosphere into space. At some point, it's going to come back into the atmosphere, and it's going to be going at about 4 kilometers a second. Now, if you have a meteorite hitting the atmosphere at that sort of speed, it burns up.
The engineers needed to know how to stop a missile being incinerated. To find the solution, they would fire Black Knight into space. The rocket tip would split off from the main body and head back down to Earth. The engineers would find out the best designs for nose cones and investigate materials that could survive extreme heat. At the Needles on the tip of the Isle of Wight, Britain's second rocket base took shape. 2 giant towers were built to house Black Knight. Gripped by huge metal jaws, it could be safely tested, secure in the knowledge it would never fly. As construction continued, engineers from the Saunders Roe Company began assembling the rocket. Black Knight would be much smaller than Blue Streak, only 30 feet in length, with 4 motors and 4 stabilizing fins. Built at a cost of just over £40,000, it was one of the most economical rockets ever made.
Each chamber can be hydraulically swiveled to give steering control by changing the direction in which the jet points.
By 1958, Black Knight was undergoing tests that would replicate a liftoff into space. When the engineers were satisfied, it would be shipped to Australia for launch.
Time 0.
The people in the tower were recording everything. Simulations of the rocket doing manoeuvres were all fed into the system to make sure that you tested that everything worked and worked reliably.
While the engineers laboured on Black Knight, Britain's main rocket was slowly taking shape. The de Havilland team were building the Blue Streak body. It would be 60 feet long and 10 feet wide. The walls were so thin, they were only kept upright by the fuel stored inside them.
The thickness of the tanks for Blue Streak is only about 2/100ths of an inch of steel. Something like a fizzy drinks can. But by filling the fizzy drinks can, suddenly it becomes much stronger.
Rolls-Royce were upgrading the Blue Streak rocket engine. It ran on a mixture of kerosene and liquid oxygen, a temperamental substance that had to be kept very cold. The RZ-2 engine would burn a ton of fuel every 2 seconds and produce a staggering 150,000 pounds of thrust.
It's the sort of thing where you could just pick up a railway engine and throw it into the sky without any problems at all. And it gives you some idea for the feel of it as compared with an ordinary firework rocket that you light at home that's hard pushed to pull its stick up into the air. But it's an enormous thrust level. It was a big animal they were playing with.
A space base had sprung up in the Cumbrian bogs to harness the power of the Blue Streak missile. Pinned to its concrete stands and caged in its metal towers, the rocket's mighty Rolls-Royce engines thundered.
You just look right into that flame, and that was very exciting. What about the coolant? How were you going to cool this fantastic flame area? Oh, thick steel, and the flame would just go right through that, just in seconds. 36,000 gallons of water a minute had to be pumped up to that stand to quench this flame that was coming out of the first unit. Brilliant.
The noise is really fantastic. Really rove railway engines or something, or rove thousands of bombers, you could say.
Brampton is 13 miles away by road, and an engine test would rattle the windows in the houses in Brampton. Not just make a roaring noise, but actually shake the windows. And we had reports of being heard 45 miles away down in the Lake District, which is a pretty big noise.
Check systems ready panel for all.
As time went on, fire rings became longer and longer, from 1.5 seconds up to maximum of 3 minutes. And if it was a success, there was high elation. You all used to shut down systems over a period of a few hours, make everything safe, and retire to one of the local pubs for a nice little ding-dong.
While the rocket engine was put through its paces, the main Blue Streak body made its way north from the de Havilland factory.
This is Blue Streak's own private road to the test stand, to Spade Adam in the heart of the Cumberland Fells, a rocket site with 10,000 acres of natural safety belt around it.
Finally, at the top secret site, the multi-million-pound jigsaw was assembled.
It looked like a tube train. I was absolutely flabbergasted at the size of it. There were people working all the way around it, people in white overalls, having little confabs and discussing what needed to be done. And it was a hive of activity that was all very well organised, but very purposeful.
At Spade Adam, the space age was taking shape. It was a blend of sleek, high technology and colossal chunks of concrete and steel.
The road transporter backed onto this erection area, hooked up to the clamps, and then the vehicle was winched through to a vertical position. There was a huge servicing tower. It was a multi-story servicing tower, but the floors opened up on hinges so that you could actually get clear space around the vehicle.
It was the scale of things that impressed me, first of all. I'd been used to working relatively small scale, and suddenly we're pitched into this 90-ton monster with 85 tons of propellants, all of which were used in 150 seconds. That was big stuff.
By 1959, Cold War tensions were increasing. The Soviets and Americans were building nuclear missiles at lightning speed. Britain had to get Blue Streak into service fast. To speed up the testing program, the missile men needed information much quicker than the primitive Spade Atom equipment could provide. They turned to another cutting-edge technology. Computers solved their problem.
It meant that completely digested, processed results could be made available within an hour, and very often quicker than that. So this meant that we were speeding up the rate of testing by a very large factor.
Britain had one of the most advanced computers in the Western world. The testing program at Spade Atom was now underway. If it proved successful, the Blue Streak rocket would be sent to Australia for launch.
The engineers who are involved know that they are at the global cutting edge of technology. They don't feel any sense of disadvantage towards America or Russia because they know that what they're doing is just as adventurous and just as much a venture into the unknown.
Britain's engineers were proud of themselves and the missile they had built and were testing. They felt they had a rocket program as good as anything the Russians and Americans had. And there was good news from Australia. The Black Knight rocket was successfully launched and flown for the first time.
Recorder started. This is it. The moment everybody has been waiting for. Black Knight is safely away.
It was soon providing priceless data for Britain's main missile program. But despite the successes, in the heart of government, there were rumblings of discontent. Critics said Blue Streak was too expensive, late into service, and vulnerable to a surprise nuclear attack. A storm was brewing which would threaten the future of Britain's superweapon. By 1959, the British twin-track missile program was well advanced. The country's main rocket, Blue Streak, was only months away from a launch. The smaller Black Knight rocket had flown and was proving a huge success. It was blazing a trail for the bigger Blue Streak missile. Black Knight had been built to test how a larger rocket would react when it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. It was only 30 feet in length, but scientifically, it was a big hitter. At a launch site at Woomera in the Australian outback, Britain's Black Knight roared into space time and again.
They launched 24 of these things, absolutely superbly. They all went up to 500-600 miles. At that stage, the main rocket sort of just got out of the way, the head blew off and shot back in again.
The observers have to record the moment of re-entry, a tricky job.
Black Knight was proving to be a world-class rocket. It was showing scientists what happened to a missile re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and it was teaching them to make a weapon shape that would be invisible to enemy radar. In the design of stealth technology, it seemed Britain had stolen a march on the two superpowers.
That information was not known to the Americans. They'd no idea. They'd never done this sort of trick. We'd no idea, of course, what the Russians were doing. But it became such high-value things that next thing we had is the Americans knocking on our door saying, please, can you tell us all about it?
Back in Britain, the focus was now on Blue Streak. The testing program had gone well. A liftoff date for the giant rocket was looming closer. The missile was put through a series of gruelling trials at Spade Adam in Cumbria to prepare it for its Australian launch.
The whole of the servicing tower was moved away. It ran on railway lines, embedded in the concrete. And the vehicle stood there, naked and unashamed.
Check systems ready panel for all lamps. All systems ready. Roger. Quiet in the control room, please.
It was extremely exciting, got the whole system going. Particularly the last few seconds, you know, you're going from minus whatever down to 0 time, and then the thing lights up and you give a huge sigh of relief.
In the iron grip of the Spade Adam stands, Blue Streak could be tested, safe in the knowledge it would never fly. The engineers were left to daydream about a real-life launch.
It was just to the point of releasing the jaws. That's where we fired up to. And if someone had pressed the wrong button, I'm sure there was a safety device in, but if some naughty fella came up and pressed the wrong button and the jaws opened, then bye-bye. It was away.
Blue Streak was now only months away from liftoff. The technology had been tested. The engineers had confidence in the rocket they'd built. But hundreds of miles south of Spade Adam, Blue Streak's enemies were plotting the downfall of Britain's superweapon. Treasury critics claimed the missile was burning money.
Blue Streak was a hugely expensive project, and it was known that it was going to be expensive. But I don't think anybody really realised at the beginning quite how expensive it was going to be. The cost of Blue Streak was estimated in 1959 as being between 500 and 600 million pounds.
Well over £1 billion in today's money. The financial case against Blue Streak was strong, but there were also growing concerns over a major design flaw. The Rolls-Royce motor used liquid oxygen, or LOX, which had to be refrigerated to minus 183 degrees. Given the low temperature, Blue Streak would take a long time to fuel up. And if the missile was left standing, the liquid oxygen might freeze vital components. Critics claimed this made Blue Streak an inflexible weapon.
If you fuel the thing too early because there's a problem on, a political problem developing, so you fuel it one afternoon and don't have to use it straight away, the wretched thing ices up. If you don't fuel it up early enough, then you're not going to be ready when the time comes. And to my mind, this was the Achilles heel of the thing.
If war came, Britain would need to fire Blue Streak in minutes. But liquid oxygen might make the missile difficult to use and slow to launch. There was an additional problem. The top brass were increasingly worried about its vulnerability. They explored novel ways of protecting the missiles, sinking them in the seabed off Dover, or putting them on trains. Then the experts found a more practical solution. They would bury them in underground concrete bunkers, called silos. It was a British brainchild every other missile nation would adopt.
We're talking about a octagonal tube sunk into the ground which contains the missile. It's about 100 foot deep. On top of that, you have got a colossal trapdoor of reinforced concrete and steel, which can be slid off to deploy the missile.
The military wanted up to 70 Blue Streak silos, but they would add a further £200 million to the bill. They would have to be built in stable rock formations, downwind of any major cities. A 400-mile chain of silos would cut through some of the best-loved landscapes in eastern England. Selling the silo idea would be a huge political problem.
It was only when we were in the last stages of developing the launcher that we realised that the siting of these launchers around the country was going to be the critical part of the programme. No one was going to like having them in their backyard.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, technology was moving on. The Americans were developing a new generation of weapons that were smaller and more accurate. The Polaris missile could be launched from submarines. Skybolt could be launched from planes. Stuck in an expensive and controversial hole, Blue Streak was beginning to look like yesterday's missile technology.
Such was the accelerating tempo of the Cold War that Russia and America kept moving the goalposts. They kept moving on. They kept looking for the next generation, and Britain just did not have the resources to keep up with that.
The military chiefs encouraged the doubts. An end to the missile program would leave more money for their pet projects. Egged on by the top brass, the government ordered a review of the Blue Streak program.
The Navy are against Blue Streak because it costs so much money, and they would like Polaris. The Army are against it because they would like to have tanks. The Air Force turned against Blue Streak because they suddenly see that the Americans were offering a missile which will prolong the life of their bombers, and they'd far rather be flying bombers than sitting in a hole in the ground.
The conclusions of the government review were devastating. Blue Streak was too costly, and it was vulnerable to a surprise Soviet attack. Building silos in the heart of the countryside would prove politically controversial, and silos might not actually protect the missile from a Russian nuclear strike. The review was shrouded in secrecy. The engineers were kept in the dark. And with liftoff only months away, their excitement was growing. But in 1960 came devastating news. The government was cancelling Blue Streak. The longed-for launch would never happen.
The cancellation was rather abrupt, and everyone were really shocked about it. We heard about it through the media. I think it was on Tuesday, and no one had been pre-warned about it. It was a political decision, this was.
Blue Streak as a missile was now a dead duck. Britain's superweapon would never fly. But the silo concept that had contributed towards its official demise lived on. The idea that the British had pioneered now crossed the Atlantic.
After we had cancelled Blue Streak, we passed over to the Americans much of our data and experience, which enabled them to build their own silos and successfully used them and maintained them throughout the rest of the Cold War.
It was the end of Blue Streak as a missile. The country went cap in hand to the Americans to ask for their superweapon instead.
In the early 50s, Britain is telling itself a story about being a great power. By 1960, Britain is telling itself a story about gracefully surrendering power, about the retreat from empire, about being Athens to America's Rome. And that story doesn't actually require us to build our own ballistic missiles.
Britain's superpower hopes had been dashed, but it was not the end of the country's rocket dreams. Tens of millions had been spent. If the government was to deflect political criticism, it needed a new role for Blue Streak. The communications revolution had begun. The maligned missile would be reborn as a space rocket. It would take satellites into orbit. Blue Streak would launch Britain on an exciting, high-tech course. Britain's ballistic missile had been cancelled. It had proved massively expensive, and experts had claimed it was vulnerable to a surprise Soviet attack. Dreams of superpower status had gone forever, but Blue Streak the rocket remained. There were hopes the missile could be turned into a moonraker to take astronauts into orbit. Britain could not be a military giant, but perhaps it could be a great nation in space.
For a while, people really did think that if there were going to be men in space, one of them would undoubtedly be a Battle of Britain pilot, some squadron leader with a pipe clinched inside his space helmet. We'd be landing on the moon, someone would be drinking tea beside the Sea of Tranquility. And there's a kind of secret connection between those science fictional dreams and what the engineers were really doing.
Quite a few organisations came up with ideas for UK man in space in the early 60s. All of them were credible. It was inherent in the technology we developed for Blue Streak. No, it could have been done. But there has to be a political will. You can't do anything without the will. And there has to be the money.
An expensive moon landing was out of Britain's league. But it was the dawn of the communications age. Blue Streak could be turned into a satellite launcher. The country had the technology, but it needed more money. Britain's European neighbours might provide it. A European rocket would help the country in other ways too. Britain was desperate to join the European Economic Community. Blue Streak was a present the country could offer to gain an entree to the European Party. Some of Britain's continental partners had their own motives too.
The reason the French wanted to get in on Blue Streak is very, very simple. Their own ballistic missile program was in trouble. And they thought that we would give them all the data on how to make the better ballistic missile, as long as they said, well, all right, we'll help you to make it into a satellite thing. We'll make one of the next stages that goes on it.
By 1962, the European space program called ELDO had begun. The new rocket would be called Europa. Blue Streak would be the powerhouse. There would be additional sections from the French, Germans and Italians.
ELDO was set up by a treaty between sovereign states, and unfortunately, the engineering detail, actually having a prime contractor, actually having somebody in control of the whole project, was ignored. Each country was in charge of its part of the operation. Now, this meant that the coordination and management of the project was always going to be susceptible to problems.
The political omens were poor, but the engineers pressed on. As the French and Germans built their rocket sections, Blue Streak finally began its journey to Australia. As a missile, it had never flown, but on the far side of the world, it would be launched as the first stage of the Europa rocket.
Great care had to be taken in handling the crate from the dock side onto the deck of the SS Auckland Star.
Blue Streak had been 8 long years in the making, but in 1964 the moment of truth had arrived. The launch would take place at Britain's Australian rocket base. The reputation of the country's scientists and engineers hung in the balance. The clock was ticking on Britain's rocket dreams.
Now they're into the countdown, a procedure of checks and actions in sequence lasting about 60 hours. On the launcher and in the control room, British and Australian technicians and engineers check and activate the rocket and launcher systems.
Timing events on all ferry plotters, and red.
Minus 30.
Roger.
Minus 15.
At minus 7 seconds, I think it was, The igniters fired the main stages. The first thing you got was a great rumbling in the solar plexus as the motors ignited. The rocket itself was held down in the launcher against the thrust until the thrust had built up to a certain level, and then the release signal was given. It was exciting to see the release arms. Suddenly the jaws would open, the arms would fly back, bits and pieces would come off, and off it went.
It looks like something from Dante's Inferno, this thing leaving the launch pad, and it was quite a spectacle. A great big trail of flame behind it, and of course all the dust and debris from the Woomera site filling the air. It was quite awesome, really.
And then you saw it disappear into the sky with a big red glow behind it, and sometimes some vapor as it went through cloud layers or something like that. So it was very exciting.
The control room would just about go mad, you know. Everyone would leap up and down and congratulate each other, and out of our hands then, it's gone, the engines are going, and we cannot do anything about it. We've done our bit, it's up to it now.
The rocket shot into space and plunged back down to the deserted outback, exactly as planned. More Blue Streak launches followed. Time after time, it performed faultlessly. The failed superweapon was proving a massive success in space. The same could not be said for the French, German and Italian sections, which were added to Blue Streak to complete the Europa rocket.
Always one of the other partners' gadgets failed in one way or the other. The remarks were unprintable. Every time was one fired, we were all sort of urging it on, you know, and eventually with a thump or a bump, the French stage would fail, or the last stage would fail. They all just fell in the ocean, and the chaps had come back totally demoralised.
After 5 years of lackluster launches, there was still no satellite in orbit. The European space program seemed to be taking Britain nowhere fast. In 1968, the government announced it was pulling out of big rocket projects. The French took over leadership of the European space program instead.
They couldn't project themselves ahead to see the commercial possibilities of this, or the technical possibilities, scientific possibilities. And I think that they were very much concerned with the economic situation.
By the early 1970s, all that remained of Britain's rocket dreams was a tiny toehold in space. Saunders Roe, the company responsible for the highly successful Black Knight, had made a larger version of the rocket. It was called Black Arrow. It had been built in the teeth of political skepticism and on a shoestring budget.
We never had more than a 3-month contract. But fortunately, my fellow directors allowed me, because I was in charge of Black Arrow from the beginning, they allowed me a free hand, so I just ignored it and pressed on merrily till somebody told me to stop.
In 1971, Black Arrow stood poised at the launch pad in Australia. On board was a British-built satellite called Prospero.
Went all the way up, absolutely like a train on rails, to exactly the right orbit, injected the Prospero into the right orbit, the bits of the other stages fell down exactly where they should have done it. And that satellite is still there to this day. And it will be up for another 30 or more years. We put it up so high.
Despite this final, flawless launch, the government announced it was cancelling the Black Arrow project on grounds of cost.
There was me. I'd been out there on the Friday congratulating them on perfect launch. Monday I had to go and tell at least half of them wouldn't have a job. How do you think I felt? I was appalled.
Britain had withdrawn from a superweapons program. Now it was finally retreating from space. By 1973, the engineers were moving out and the scrap merchants were moving in, as the main Blue Streak base at Spade Adam in Cumbria finally shut down.
I went up to site for the last time, for no particular reason. I just wanted to go up for the last time. And I looked at this tower and I thought to myself, in quite a short time, people are going to come and hack this to bits and there's going to be nothing left. And you know, I don't know in a way what sort of made me think of it, but I went and got a pot of paint and a brush. And on one of the big girders on the top, I just wrote in large white letters, "We did good work here for a long, long time."
The Americans and Russians had established themselves in space. With the help of the knowledge they had gained from Blue Streak, the French built their Ariane rocket. It would roar into the void, left by Britain's retreat from space. Brilliant British technology had become an historical curiosity. Blue Streak was now a giant museum piece. The country's rocket dreams were over, and the superpower aspirations that had underpinned them seemed a lifetime away.
The geography of space in people's imaginations in the 60s all had to do with Cape Canaveral. It was an American geography, but behind it and alongside it there was this shadowy other geography. For a while, the space age had a British manifestation. The space age was happening in Cumbria. The space age was happening on the Isle of Wight. The space age was happening in Australia.
We had the best technicians in the world, and I say that without any hesitation. We will never, ever have the community that we had at that time, with so many people that were so keen to do so much.
The country had reached for the stars and fallen short. But the Blue Streak superweapon had shown that Britain had the brains, but not the financial brawn, to be a superpower in space.